To start off with, I'd like to still introduce this esteemed group of panellists. So the fellow up there on the left here, this is Andrew Curthoys. I've known Andrew for a few years now, and he's been very proactive with respect to, in fact, I've got a lot to thank him for, because he was the man behind really mandating the open BIM standards with the Queensland government and championing that. Very tough challenge to get through that. But now he's been involved with the Cross River Rail project, and so he's at the delivery end of it all. I was involved at the very start when we were putting this whole thing together, so I have to catch up with Andrew about that. Anyway, we'll move on and you'll hear more from Andrew. There's Dr. Delton Chen, who I again have known for many years. And Delton's an extraordinary fellow. He says he's not an economist, but he knows more about economics than anybody else I know. And he's a bit of a rock star internationally, and has got a lot of influence in a lot of different circles. Plus he's got a lot of key fans and followers from people with influence around the world. Also, he was interviewed just recently, told me, by the Wall Street Journal and other sort of great papers, so he's quite well known internationally. Now, jumping across to Joseph. Joseph is a visionary, and I've really got met with him through different contexts, through Noel, and also through Dr. Kate Crawford and others. And Noel's somebody who's got lots of vision, lots of talent, lots of ideas and technology, and can go across the sort of the paradigms, if you like, with respect to thinking things culturally, economic and environmentally, and brings it all together in a very special sort of way. And so it's a privilege to have you, Joseph, on this team, and be part of that. Also, he's very keen on the metaverse, so through metaverse conversations. Now, Kath, looking at sort of next paradigm thinking with respect to how you fund different sort of projects and doing things, so we'll be hearing from her with Big Carbon Planet. And two more to go. There's Ross. I just had the pleasure of meeting Ross last week, and Ross is involved with, he's coming from sort of a more sort of formal sort of financial, sort of looking at dealing with very complex transactions and things like that. And he's had a lot of experience with AI companies and with the infrastructure projects and all sorts of different things there. So hearing sort of where he's coming from that, very interesting looking sparring bit it's going to go on between him and Delton in this next conversation with the different approaches. And then finally, last but not least, is the famous Noel Robinson. So Noel's probably the most famous architect in Brisbane, if not Australia. He's the Sky Tower project. If you look up towards the heavens and look at the thing that's closest to that, that's one of Noel's creations. He's done all sorts of different projects, including Longreach at the Qantas Museum that's there. And so Noel's also been involved. We spoke earlier on about WISC. So Noel was the head of the advisory board for WISC when they were looking at Australia as an option, so it was very instrumental in that. And then, here's me, last and least. So I've been introduced already on it. So what we've got is we've got 6 questions for the panel, and they're sort of quite verbose questions, so they're on that sort of theme of smart, safe, sustainable. We've got pretty limited time, but what will come out of this will give the sort of the framework and the priorities and that for the task force that will follow through and take action on it. So the first question is around looking at considering the importance of sustainable infrastructure. We've heard about this in the previous presentation by Alan, and the potential economic benefits. And how can public and private sector collaboration be encouraged to drive innovation and investment in this space? And also, how can we ensure that such partnerships benefit all stakeholders, including local communities and the government? Now, I've told the tap two of the people here to start it, but then everyone can speak about it. But there's Ross and there's Noel on this first one here. But if you want to start with it.
Yep. So, in my involvement with both the infrastructure industry and using advanced technologies like AI and machine learning, big data, my involvement's been involved around financing for those new ideas, where there's there's a disruptive technology that can be put into use to create better outcomes for stakeholders. I think at Paramount, public sector procurement processes need to be across and understand those new technologies and be open to using new technologies in part of their procurement processes. But the private sector, engineers, designers, architects, while they're for the most part, the most innovative thinkers, sometimes their business models are more resistant to change than what you would believe, because they're the incumbents. So there's a couple of companies that I've been involved with. One is a local business called Opted AI, which uses its artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to identify project risk, generally about 2/3 of the time earlier than it would physically be identified, and that's in both terms of time and cost overruns. That piece of technology is available and can be used by the infrastructure developers in Australia and around the world. But surprisingly, they're quite resistant to using that, because the data may not be aligned, it might not be perfect. Companies don't want to share their data, and there's a resistance to change. So I think the biggest thing that the public and private sector can do in order to create shared benefits from the development of sustainable infrastructure is embrace those new technologies to the fullest extent possible, so that you lead to transparency in cost and risk, and benefit sharing, being able to trace those benefits using the advanced technologies which are at our disposal.
Thanks, Ross. Noel, did you want to make any comments on that?
I think that the future's the future, obviously, but back in the mid-70s, when I started my practice, I was one of the first architects to actually write an environmental policy for the firm and the direction that we take. That morphed into something called sustainability, and really sustainability is morphed now into regenerative design. And I think we need to consider those sort of things now in today's discussions, because sustainability is like the last phase. Today it's regeneration. And I think if you look at the definitions of those things carefully, you'll find that we're in this next stage. And that's where we need to be focusing, and that's a very complex stage to be in, because it's really the future of where we're going. It's a more encompassing and cyclical process that's just not to do with sustainability. And people talk about sustainability, and I've spoken about it a lot, and I think that when you look at the definition of regeneration, regenerative design, I think that's where we really should be focusing our new efforts. I'm involved in lots of different sort of projects, and I get presented all sorts of problems, as Richard mentioned, even up to things in the future, which is urban air mobility. We're doing studies of what that might look like. We're looking at the future of motor testing and new ways of developing the motor industry. So we're not just dealing with architecture anymore, we're looking at wider issues in the community. I think that working in the city, which I've worked in now for nearly 50 years, and I love it, it's one of the very special places in the world. The world is subtropical where we are. About 1/6 of the world's population lives in it, and about 40% of the Earth's mass, not air, but surface area, is to do with subtropicality. Design is all about how you live and how you protect yourself and deal with the evolving climatic conditions that we live in. I'm not a climate tragic, but I am certainly somebody who is very aware of what's happening and needs to address it. I've been involved in things like, I started the Buildings that Breathe in the Brisbane City Council. I sat down then with the councillor, Amanda Cooper, who was chair of planning, and said, look, we've got to build buildings in Brisbane that respond to the climate. I've done the same thing at the Sunshine Coast Council. We've delivered the Yellow Book up there. I'm doing the same with the Noosa Council. They're on the verge of just releasing a book fairly soon. and we've started discussions with the Gold Coast Council. So sustainability is about advocating. It's advocating what you think that is the best solution to a lot of these people, particularly the politicians, because they're the ones that are sprouting off stuff that, they can talk about the sustainability and everything, but they're not up to date. They're just talking gobbledygook that pleases the masses. And they're the people we've really got to start to now educate about regeneration and how to deal with the new level of issues we've got to deal with in the way that we transport, the way that we build buildings, because as an architect I'm finding that our remit is becoming wider and wider, and we're getting more involved in things like, our builders today have got some serious problems. They've got serious financial issues. They've got serious supply delivery issues. They've got serious labour shortages. So the whole thing is going to lead to actually having buildings built by robots. It's on the way. And I think that the issue now is this year, I think we've got probably one of the most serious years we're going to face some level of downturn in our economy, and we've got to work out how to do that. I mean, I know the builders are in trouble. I can't say who they are, but I know there's a number of builders in serious trouble. I know that I can't get materials for my jobs. I know last week there was a project down the Gold Coast. It was had a tender price of 36 million. Then the builder put his price up to 71 million. That developer had to pull the pin. He'd been through design, planning, sold the lot, 100% sold. Couldn't get a builder to delivery. Another project I saw yesterday up in Gregory Terrace, same thing. Sold out, builder can't deliver, can't get a builder. So, we've got a fantastic place here, fantastic economy, and we do know how to do stuff. We are creative, and we know how to solve the bigger picture. But the thing is, we are running into some serious problems beyond our capability of solving them. So that's how we've got to sort of look at what the issue is about sustainable and regenerative. So it's right at the start.
Thank you both, and we'll move on to the next question just with the interest of time, but all the others can make comments about those ones as they move through. The second question is aimed at Joseph and Kat, and it's just looking at food from a cultural and social perspective. And I know Kat said to me before, there's no boundaries between any of these things. It's all just one pure continuum. So what key factors must be considered when designing and implementing smart, safe, sustainable buildings and infrastructure? And also, how can we ensure that the built environment is inclusive and respectful of diverse cultural backgrounds, particularly for Indigenous communities? So maybe, where do you want to start?
I think having, testing, yep. So I think having some sort of platform, or obviously engagement with communities, always talked about in projects. Whatever community you're working in, you need to engage with the stakeholders, shareholders, the local community members, businesses and things like that. But I think some sort of platform probably will emerge that will have some sort of full-time feedback system, like allowing communities, businesses, organizations, to put their input in, their collective vision, if you will, is the way to move forward. So, everyone has a say, a voice, some input, a perspective, and I think there should be a platform, probably a digital platform will emerge, an organization, something that will enable, or just standard practices to enable that type of feedback then into projects. Yep. Whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, or from any multicultural background.
Yeah, look, I might wrap up a whole range of questions in this one answer, but it's following on from Joe's comment there around a big, bold vision. Really linking back to that first question, I think what drives investment is a big, bold vision. And I'll give you an example. Down in Sydney, there's a big, bold vision for the Parramatta River that, in 10 years, the Parramatta River will be swimmable. That's the kind of vision that investment follows and that community want to get involved with. And then, as you say, Joe, I think it's important to have that platform to really have that real-time conversation with our community, to have them involved from day one in, developing what that might look like.
For sure.
So I think that's really critical. And then I think there's another really important piece that's linked back to both Noel and Ross's earlier comments. For us to consider design, there's obviously the huge lag time between when we get our approvals right through to when we've actually delivered a project. So therefore, we need to look 10 years or more into the future and say, okay, what are those trends that, both the community and our world are actually, following? And what does that mean for our design and our delivery in another 10 years' time, once we've got all our approvals in place? So, we've got so many trends that are evident right now that, we need to be building in from a systems perspective to every single development, really. And they're things like, demographic change, technology change, climate change. There's so many trends. Remote work, of course, so people are working, out of cities even now, or on the fringes of cities. Green space and sustainability. So when we start thinking about all those things from a design perspective and to build them in today, it really means that we need a clear view of what that future looks like and linking that to the bold view of what we're trying to create here. Otherwise, we could go down a path that in 10 years' time means that we actually can't deliver a good outcome for the community.
Great. Now, the next question is for Team Andrew Delton. So it's digital twin technology with AI, IoT, and BIM and blockchain, blah, 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 remote sensing and other spatial sciences are increasingly important in sustainable infrastructure development. So the question is, how can these processes, and I sort of say processes because BIM is not a technology, it's a process, how can these processes, technologies, and open standards be leveraged to most effectively address environmental challenges such as climate change and resource depletion, which has been picked up, while providing economic opportunities for businesses and communities?
Well, what I have to say about climate change, because that's my area of speciality, is that it is inherently an information-rich problem. It's probably one of the most complex problems humanity will ever face, because we'd have to decarbonise effectively every sector of the world economy and more, because even if we do decarbonise at the highest rate possible, our residual emissions will still be significant. It's estimated that residual emissions through the century, in a very optimistic case, would be about 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which would cost about $1 trillion per year to remove. So that gives you some idea of the scope of the problem. Another way to measure it is in financial terms. We're talking, say, another $3-4 trillion per year spent on climate to decarbonise. So the point I make is that whenever we try to decarbonise, the problem reverts back to the intricacies of every specific technology, industry and sector. And that means monitoring, collecting information and optimisation. And this is where these technologies really, I think, will play a huge role. I'm very impressed by artificial intelligence. I think it's going to massively improve efficiency. I'm impressed by Internet of Things. That's definitely the future. Blockchains, it's another whole story, but as a technology, it's very useful. Cryptocurrencies, that's another distraction, but something missing, I think, is virtual reality and augmented reality. That's brilliant when we need to design buildings and optimise for energy, heat, electricity consumption and so on. So I think the future is absolutely bright in this sector. We could talk about this more later, but what I think is missing is the economics. So we tend to look at the problem of climate locally because we live and work in our local environment. But I think, as we'll discuss later, I think we need a global, local combination involving financial mechanisms that are new and revolutionary. So I'll put that forward later.
To Andrew.
Thanks, Don. What he said, basically. Look, no, I think that the opportunities are endless, but we need to work out the critical questions we're trying to answer. Right, we've got so much technology and we've got so many data sets. It's what are the questions that we're wanting to answer, get solutions for, to break it down into answers that people can understand. Right? This is, with digital twin. So work we're doing at the moment is looking at digital twin for SEQ, right, Southeast Queensland, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's fantastic." Yeah, well, it is. But what's the challenge? What's the value proposition? What's the challenge we're trying to address to enhance service delivery, to enhance, the community's lives collectively and individually, to reduce flooding risk, to reduce bushfire risk, to reduce all those climate change elements that we know are coming. So what can we do to improve outcomes, improve the livability, if you like, for individuals? How do we get around the city more easily? How do we utilise space more effectively? All those sorts of things. So one of the things that I think digital twins, IoT, BIM, and all that technology can do, and the processes behind it, importantly, Richard, is give decision makers much more clear information on which to base some of their policy outcomes. Right? If we can do that and improve the lives of even, all these people in the room, that will be a success. But if we can then roll that out to broader communities, to communities which don't have the same accessibility to information that governments do, that will be an enormous benefit for SEQ and then ultimately for Queensland and the world. But we need to be working out what the questions are we're trying to address, not just say, here's a solution. Okay, what's the problem we've got?
Yes, well answered. Right, the next question is aimed at Dalton and with Ross. So we're getting more into this economics currency space, but with the growing adoption of digital currencies and their potential to impact on infrastructure financing, first question is, how can we harness these technologies to incentivise decarbonisation efforts and support sustainable development? And the second thing is, what are the potential economic, cultural, social, environmental implications of using digital currencies in this context?
You go first.
Have to go. Okay. Look, as soon as we talk about currencies, it's an enormous topic, so we've got to narrow it down a little bit. I think on the tip of everybody's tongue are crypto, because FTX collapsed and there's a realization that this market has got problems. That's not going to be a solution anyway. I don't think any cryptocurrency of any form could really resolve our environmental sustainability problems. If we move into carbon markets, there's an amalgamation of blockchain with carbon credits that's quite popular, but carbon markets also have an inherent limitation, is that they're not going to scale because of offsetting is not a solution for actually decarbonising. It tends to invite greenwashing and introduces new risks. So where do we look for our inspiration? My advice is we've got to go back to the institutions and look at central banks and look at commercial banking and how it works, because that's a topic that I think most people are not that familiar with. It's a bit of a mystery actually how central banks work. So to give a bit of context, and I'll be brief here, I've been working on the carbon currency solution for nearly 9 years, so I'm very biased with my response. But my response is, I believe that there is an opportunity to create an international unit of account as an asset to fully fund strategically important mitigation around the world. It just, in my opinion, it needs to be backed by central banks to become an asset, an investable asset. So this is a big idea. The policy for this is now available. If you want to apply to review it, you're more than welcome. I'm going to be actually raising money for this demonstration for the carbon currency. But to get to the point, what can it do for us? Well, if it can actually scale to the few $1 trillion a year, well targeted, effective finance, then we have a chance of staying below the 1.5 to 2 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. My own opinion is, if we don't have something like this to break through, I think we're going to some very dangerous global warming in the future, and it's looking quite grim actually. So now's the time to be innovative and to look at all possible solutions, particularly currencies, because they can be so powerful if designed well.
Thanks, Dalton. I'll start with saying that 45 years ago I sat in a university lecture and heard about carbon pricing, and it's troubled me ever since, until I read Dalton's paper online about the carbon currency. And I've had an aha moment. I'm a crypto skeptic, so while I am a strong advocate for the benefit of blockchain technology, I don't see cryptocurrency as being necessarily the solution or a store of wealth. However, when you apply the methodology that Dalton's been talking about with a carbon currency as effectively being a medium of exchange that captures a carbon price and makes it tradable, and it does have some central bank regulation and governance around it, then I think you're really looking at a recipe for success. There's a new buzzword in agriculture at the moment, and it's called, buzz phrase, I should describe it as the second crop, and that's measuring, the abatement impact of carbon farming and putting a price on that and monetising that. So investment banks are onto this concept. There is a lack of transparency, a general lack of provenance in terms of how carbon credits and abatement certificates are created and traded at the moment. But I think if you have a centralised mechanism for it, you're on the verge of a breakthrough moment where, for example, take it away from the agricultural environment, put it into road building, for example. If you can build a road that reduces emissions by, creating a faster way for those electric cars to get to where they get to, and you monetise that, then it creates a second income stream apart from the tolls. The concept, I think, has strong merit. I'd encourage you to visit Dalton's website to have a view, because it certainly grabbed my attention.
That's great. So now we're on to, this is for Team Noel and Kath, this time, spotlights on you both. And as the demand for sustainable infrastructure and clean energy grows, firstly, how can we ensure the supply chain remains resilient and diverse while minimising environmental, cultural and social risk? And the second question is, what role can circular economy principles and new business models play in de-risking the supply chain and promoting long-term sustainability? Now, remember also that the de-risking of the supply chain was something that the two governments, when they met in November, in the forum, said this was a very key issue. So, Kath and Noel.
Thanks, Noel. Oh, look, once again, these questions are also intertwined. Resilient supply chains, I think that we can really leverage technology. I mean, we've just heard a few comments here around, whether crypto and other things are part of the solution or not. And in fact, talked a little bit about some of the challenges in the current supply chains, of which we know there are quite a few. I do believe that it's not just one piece of technology or one currency, in fact, that solves this problem. It's what we bring together in terms of the whole technology stack, and how we look at pooling the funds that we've got available to us, of which crypto might be some, might be sort of one stream. But how do we effectively pool all the funding available to us? Because there's a lot of funding when you look globally in this space, whether that's from the individual perspective right through to, large institutional investment. The question is, how do we effectively and strategically target that? And I think, we're seeing various models like opportunity zones over in the US, where they've started to say, okay, well, how do we get smart about this? And we identify these locations around our city or around our country, in fact, that would achieve a whole range of different outcomes. And then how do we pool the funding we've got available to us to be able to achieve it? And then obviously touching on the transparency issue and other challenges in the markets. Well, the technology stack brings the answer to that as well. We have the ability now to connect a buyer to the seller very directly and in a very measurable way. The question is, why are we not doing that just yet? Because we can solve all of those supply chain problems with with 5 technologies we've got available to us right now. So for me, I think it comes back to, what is that big, bold vision? What are the opportunity zones that we want to create and start de-risking for pooled investment? And what are the new business models that are emerging? I mean, Noel touched on this a little bit earlier. We really need to be thinking, how do we generate income from these new assets, and new bioeconomies? Not the traditional way of looking at it, which is what's the cost of sustainability? No, there's a different approach now. What are the various income streams we can generate from these new assets? So I think there's an incredible opportunity right now, and I think we can look to others around the world. And I'll just give you one example, and Noel will have another 50, I'm sure. But one example in the US, obviously the car manufacturers are needing to change very significantly in terms of both their operations and also their supply chains. So there are car manufacturers in the US that are creating local manufacturing hubs using 3D printing, where instead of needing multi-millions to set up their factory, they can set up a small factory on the corner of a residential block using a 3D printer. That creates completely different opportunities for us. And I think if we want to think both local and global, let's just say Brisbane as an example, could be looking to our regional towns and saying, listen, Toowoomba or St George, or let's work together to create some regional manufacturing hubs, low-cost regional manufacturing hubs, so that our regions can have new jobs, new industries, and supply our cities. There's great opportunities in this, and Noel, over to you to talk more about those.
Well, in particular, Toowoomba that you mentioned, that's where we're looking at doing the development of the motor industry in our future. And as you're probably aware, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that manufacturers lose every year because of recalls. Vehicles aren't developed sufficiently for the market. There's not enough new technology, although now with electric vehicles and other things happening, there is quite a bit of mobility occurring in that area. But Australia's virtually lost its one-time dominance that it had in Melbourne about building motor vehicles, and the whole thing's changing. As Richard mentioned before, I've been advising WISC. We've managed to get them signed up to the Council of Mayors to do basically to come into Brisbane within the next 10 years and be fully operational. Hopefully we'll see them within 5 years, and they're in the crawl phase, and then they'll be in the run phase, and so they'll be we'll see a new element in urbanity in terms of decarbonisation of the airline industry and motor vehicles, and that'll change the locational theory of where people live and where they play, because you imagine this is real, and I know it's real, and it's real also from an acceptance point of view from the local authorities. But you'll be able to live in Sanford or Redcliffe or wherever and get into town in 10-15 minutes. You just fly over congestion, and it's the same price as a black Uber. Well, you can't tell me that's not going to be attractive to people. To get out to Stratty on the weekend, take you 10-15 minutes to get over and be on Cylinder Beach instead of waiting sort of 3 or 4 hours driving a car and ferries and costing you hundreds of dollars. This is a revolution we're going to see in our lifetime, and it's all happening. And it's happening in conjunction with the mobility of vehicles as well. There's a lot of things happening in that space, but the thing is, it will change where you live and the value of properties. Sky Tower was mentioned before. That is a population density on that side, 1 person per square metre. Now that's quite incredible. There's 1,400 apartments there on a 3,000 metre site. The density is unbelievable, and moving through all these new PDAs that we're developing, as well as the city plan, we've got a lot of opportunities to increase our density in this city, but it's got to be for the best. And I was talking to one of the council officers before. There's a theory that we don't have enough parkland in the city. I actually dispute that. We have the botanical gardens. We've got the fantastic park up there at near Gregory Terrace, the Victoria Park, but not only that, but it's what's that other park, the Roma Street Gardens. And every time I go there, there's nobody there. You know, they're not being used. And the thing is that we do have to sort of challenge where it's all going. The thing about business relationships and resilience is that councils have really got to work closely with their communities and develop those as well. I mean, everybody knows that with that, but my business anyway is a relationship-built business. And I think everybody's, at the end of the day, has got relationships. And they've got to be meaningful and resilient, and you've got to be innovative about what you're creating for the future, so you've got to understand it. Now, look, I can't understand the future. I'd love to think I could, but you've got things like, the cost of human capital. We're not building all that into stuff. Now, the GABA should not be pulled down. You know, the GABA is one thing that somebody's made an error on, and they're digging a hole deeper and deeper and deeper. It's like lateral thinking. Once you start digging a hole, you don't keep digging deeper if it's wrong. You got to pull out and say this is wrong, and do something else. But the GABA is going to be a tragedy for everybody who lives around there. It can't be solved in a physical sense. It's like the road's got to go under the ground, or whatever they've got to do. But it is just too congested and doesn't work. And that's my personal view, and I think it should go somewhere else. So it's the issue about human capital. When you decide to pull a building down, you've got to think about what's there, because this is all to do with sustainability and the regenerative economy we're moving into. If a building is really good, obviously you try to keep the building. If it's terrible, it's like doing an extension on a house. It's a terrible house. Just get over it, knock it over and do it again. These are big decisions you've got to make when you move into the built environment. So I think that the circular economy and regenerative thinking is really important at this stage of our development. And I think that we need to adapt and thrive and transform ourselves to be creative about the way that we think about all those things. And it's like everything, you've just got to take everything from first principles, see what the issue is and move forward. And I not only do that, but I think that I intuitively think about stuff. You know, I think every time you think about a solution, you've got to think about the big picture. It's just not focused like that. That's all.
Thank you. Right, on to the last question now. I'm adding Andrew to the list. Because I think we've got to hear a last word from you, but it's this is looking at how can we integrate cultural, social, environmental considerations into developing smart, safe, sustainable buildings and infrastructure. So going back to the title of what was that, while creating economic opportunities for local communities. And can you provide examples or successful projects or initiatives that you've achieved with this delicate balance?
Thanks, Richard, for the opportunity. I mean, I think one of the things that we are, and I'll use Crossrail Rail as an example, one of the things that we're doing there is really working with the groups that will have the hardest or have the least ability sometimes to access public transport. So a person with disability, mum pushing a pram, you know, all those sorts of groups. There's some groups who have come to us and said, you know, we really appreciate the way you're engaging with some of the most disabled in our community, because if we can get a person with a severe disability onto a train, right, that's going to change the way they view the city. It's going to change the way they view how they can interact, gives them more independence. It also changes the way that they then move about the city, because they suddenly have this newfound freedom that they probably have never used before. So that's one of the cultural changes that we're looking at, right, and engaging more effectively with the person with a disability. We've also been very focused with the Crossrail Rail work on working with Indigenous traditional owners of the lands on which we are traversing, right? Because essentially Crossrail Rail is, you know, a connected network or creating new connections, but building on the connections that generations of Indigenous people have been making as they get closer to the river and as they migrate from the river. So, Brisbane, as we all know, is very rich river country, right? Mary Cook suggests it's a city with a river problem, right? It floods, but over generations, what that has done is that has brought people to look at the sources of food, look at the way that they can interact, look at the way that they can use it. Crossrail Rail is trying to capitalise on that and looking at the social and cultural opportunities and then transform the way that the city's going to work. And what we're going to see when it opens and people start getting used to it is a complete change in the way that the CBD works, a complete change in the way that people consider public transport. And so I think it'll be a really good outcome as people start to accept this new way of moving around the city, and there'll be cultural change, there'll be better social outcomes, and people that haven't accessed the city this way before will suddenly find new ways of getting in here. Right? That will change then how communities look at the infrastructure delivery. So that any of the Olympics infrastructure will have to take that focus of cultural engagement, will have to take that focus around making sure it's accessible for all, truly accessible for all, not just accessible for those who have a minor disability. So I think that the Crossrail Rail has been transformative in the way that the government has been delivering a major piece of infrastructure for Brisbane.
That's great. Joseph?
Yeah, I can add one little thing to that. Maybe a real world example that I had a couple of years ago. There was an property development down in Melbourne that was developing a property. They found some Indigenous bones, Aboriginal bones, and artifacts and things like that. And they were concerned that their project or their property development would get held back or delayed, more costs and things like that. To sum it up, they didn't see the value in alerting the public or recognising it, making an issue about the Indigenous bones and artifacts. But I went through a discussion with the property developers, and I was able to convince them at the end that cultural heritage does have a dollar value, that they could, for example, it's by discovering the bones and recognising that and all the artifacts and the indigenous items, it's an opportunity to engage the local community, hear their thoughts on the issue. But again, as the property developer, it was going to be like some shops and things like that. But they could have made for example, I suggested they could have made a cultural heritage site around, the shops. The shop property development could have integrated a Indigenous cultural heritage site. They could have had, like glass floors or something showcasing the artifacts on the ground, and that would have brought more people to the site, and it would have added more value to the shops around the area because more foot traffic and things like that, and the engagements that you would get with the community, and the other programs can be developed from the funds that are raised from that, or the cultural awareness of the Indigenous people and stuff like that. So that's just an example of thinking needs to change as well when it comes to cultural heritage, how it can add value to the environment, to the society, and to people living in that area, tourism, things like that. So yeah.
Noel, did you want to make last comment on it?
I just think designing for climate. It's a bit of a hobby horse, but it's really important. Designing for climate can make a really big difference to the way our cities look and feel and operate. I mean, in 2021 there was 30%, 29% of Australia's generation was from renewable energies. Solar was 12, wind was 10, hydro was 6. Today it's nearly double that. And I think that designing buildings to sit on the site for passive solar is one of the most important things architects and other people can do to design the buildings, because you sort of face the building the right way. You've got to get the right breezes, you've got to shade it in the right direction, insulate it in the areas where it's going to get heat load, and it's such a simple exercise. It's like basic, and we're turning out with delivering buildings that don't even meet these things. And it's a fundamental thing that we can do that's going to reduce our energy costs enormously. And I think that, we're globally, not a big emitter globally, even though percentage we are up there a bit. But we've got to remember that we can afford to build buildings correctly and live in them efficiently and beautifully, that's what life's all about. You know, get the breezes, wanting sun, can watch the moon rise. You know, we're all living human beings. That's what we've got to deliver in the way that we build things and live. I think that's a really important thing we shouldn't forget.
Kath?
Yeah, I think it's always great to look at some examples, and maybe to pick on some very specific points made by other speakers. I'll just give a couple of examples that might prompt some thinking in this space. I mean, firstly, the whole new business models being developed in the space. So, Aqua Revo, which is a development recently constructed out of Melbourne, and some of you may be aware of that. I mean, that's got some great outcomes, and it's required a lot of thinking across the business models for utilities. So not only they've begun with the end in mind, they've said what's a sustainable, community of the future, and how do we design for that? So they've built sustainability into their buildings. They've looked at flood resilience for that particular development, and they've looked at what the utilities business model is. And so in that, what they've created there is the utility actually owns the gutters and the rain tanks of every house. So they manage the rain tanks actually to be able to deal with the peaks in rainfall, to be able to manage that right across the development. So that outcome has required completely different thinking around what is a utility of the future. And then coming back to flood resilience, I mean, we can learn from others around the world, and in some cases I think we think to ourselves that's not relevant here, but I think there's always a lesson we can take from others. And I'll give you an example. A trip to Cambodia for me some years ago led to me being fascinated by the fact that the Cambodians, in a very low-cost way, had created houses that rose and fell with the floodwater. And I thought, wow, they've achieved this with bamboo and probably equivalent of our $20. So these don't have to be high-cost solutions. It's just we have to think about it in a slightly different way. And we also have to think about business models in the case of a building. A building now, every building in this city could be creating an income stream for the city or for the owner. I mean, there's technology out there now that means we can use every pane of glass to generate solar. This starts to mean that instead of every building being a user of resources, it can actually be a contributor of resources. So that changes everything in terms of the design of a city.
Ross and Dalton, do you want the last words?
I might as well speak now. So my just final comment, I think we have to make a decision collectively if we're actually serious about staying under 1.5 to 2 degrees. I know that's not the only issue we face as a civilization. There's other things besides the climate, but the climate's going to govern our quality of life forever. So what are we going to do about this? And I think we have to consider major disruption to the economy and to our understanding of what change means. So I think we're still in a very incremental stage of transition, and if we get the economics right, I could see an exponential change, and the financing's got to drive in the right direction. I don't think taxes and sticks are sufficient on their own. We need more carrots, and a combination of carrots and sticks, good regulation and good governance, we might get there.
That's good. And Ross, last word for you.
Thanks, Richard. I'll just pick up on a point made by Noel around the construction and building industry, certainly in this part of the world. And we'll talk about an unsustainable business model where builders of all categories are being exposed to all the risks associated with the project, operating on razor-thin margins. If ever there was an industry that needs a change in how it operates, it's the building and construction industry. The government is doing its best to introduce new regulation around project trust accounts and the like in Queensland, and I think there's similar models being put in place in other states. But if it would simply take the use of some fairly simple technology that's available now to create an open system of supply chain and supply chain transparency and margin management to make, I'd say, 80% of the current crisis go away. We've seen at least 1,700 families disappointed with the collapse of Porter Davis, which is one of the major residential builders. I think, I agree with Noel. I think there's a real storm coming in the construction industry, and that, from a sustainability perspective, is one industry that's in dire need of doing things differently, using data, using big data, artificial intelligence, and open and transparent systems to do things differently and change the way those business models work.
Well, thank you very much, and they've gone over time, so I apologise for that, but thank you, Noel, Ross, Kath, Delton, Andrew and Joseph. Excellent conversations, and again, you can mix and mingle over lunch and meet with everyone, and good discussions, so support the vernacular.